I'm Sarah Mitchell, 35, and I thought my father's retirement party would finally be my moment to shine in front of our extended family. Instead, Dad stood at the podium and delivered the most humiliating speech of my life. "My daughter Sarah," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "Well, she's still figuring things out. Unlike her successful brother Mark, Sarah's just bouncing between temp jobs and living paycheck to paycheck." The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter while my cheeks burned with shame. What Dad didn't know was that 3 months ago, I'd secretly launched a tech startup that just secured a $2 million seed funding round. The contract was burning a hole in my purse, and in exactly 10 minutes, my business partner would walk through those doors to make an announcement that would change everything. Like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family. As I stood there, my father's words still echoing in the decorated banquet hall, I felt the familiar weight of childhood report cards in my memory. Straight A's that were never quite good enough. Honor roll certificates that gathered dust while Mark's participation trophies gleamed on the mantel. The irony wasn't lost on me that those same academic achievements had led me to this moment, holding a contract worth more than Dad's entire retirement fund. The gathering around us represented 30 years of family dynamics I'd learned to navigate like a minefield. Aunt Linda whispered something behind her wine glass to Uncle Robert, both of them stealing glances at me with that mixture of pity and superiority I'd grown accustomed to. Cousin Jennifer, fresh from her divorce and back living with her parents, actually had the audacity to pat my shoulder sympathetically. "Don't worry, Sarah," she whispered conspiratorially. "You'll figure it out eventually. We all bloom at different times." Different times. I almost laughed out loud. While she'd been spending her trust fund on designer handbags and failed marriages, I'd been coding until 3 in the morning, building something revolutionary. The condescension in her voice was the same tone I'd heard my entire life. The voice of people who confused loud confidence with actual competence. My phone buzzed in my purse. A text from James. "Parking now. Ready to change some minds?" I typed back quickly. "More than ready." The seed funding contract felt like it was radiating heat through my clutch. In less than 10 minutes, every assumption these people had about me would crumble. Mark appeared at my elbow, his arm draping around my shoulders in that protective big brother gesture that had fooled everyone for years. "Don't take it personally, sis," he said, his breath carrying the scent of expensive whiskey. "You know how Dad gets at these things. He's just proud of what I've accomplished with the consulting firm." What he'd accomplished. I bit my tongue to keep from mentioning that his consulting firm was hemorrhaging money faster than he could spend Dad's investments. The fake MBA diploma hanging in his office was just the tip of the iceberg. I'd done my research. His business credentials were as fabricated as his concern for my feelings. "Of course," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "We all know how proud he is of your success." The room buzzed with conversation, but I caught fragments that made my chest tighten. Such a shame about Sarah. Never quite lived up to her potential. Mark really got the business gene in that family. Each comment was a small cut. But I'd developed thick skin over the years. Tonight, that skin would serve me well. I looked toward the entrance, my heart beginning to race. Any moment now, James Morrison would walk through those doors, and the carefully constructed narrative of my family's golden child and disappointing daughter would shatter like glass. Mark had been the golden child since the day I was born, or so the family legend went. The story they loved to tell was how 3-year-old Mark had looked into my crib and declared, "She's not as smart as me." Dad thought it was hilarious. Mom thought it was precious. I grew up thinking it was prophecy. By the time we were in elementary school, the pattern was set in stone. Mark's B- was celebrated with ice cream dinners. My A+ was met with, "That's nice, honey," while Dad helped Mark with his homework. When Mark struggled with math, Dad hired a tutor. When I excelled in advanced calculus, Dad wondered aloud if I was focusing too much on schoolwork instead of social skills. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Mark got the car for his 16th birthday, a shiny red Honda that he promptly crashed into Mrs. Henderson's fence 2 weeks later. Dad laughed it off as boys being boys and paid for the repairs. When I turned 16, I got a lecture about responsibility and a bus pass. I worked weekends at the local grocery store to save for my own car, a 12-year-old Toyota that got me through high school and college. College was where the divide became most apparent. Dad co-signed Mark's student loans without hesitation, even though his grades were mediocre and his major changed every semester. When I got a full scholarship to study computer science, Dad seemed almost disappointed. "Computer science?" he'd said, wrinkling his nose. "That's a bit nerdy for a girl, don't you think? What about something more social?" But it was Mark's fake MBA that truly revealed the depth of Dad's blind spot. I'd discovered it 3 months ago while helping Mom organize Dad's office files. There, in a folder labeled Mark's Achievements, was a diploma from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. I knew Mark had never attended Northwestern. He'd dropped out of community college after 2 semesters to pursue entrepreneurship, yet somehow, this expensive-looking fake diploma had convinced everyone, including Dad, that Mark was qualified to run a consulting business. The consulting business itself was a house of cards. I'd seen the financial statements Dad kept proudly displayed in his den, losses mounting year after year, client complaints piling up, employees leaving faster than they could be replaced. But Dad kept writing checks, kept believing that Mark's next big idea would turn everything around. The tax records I'd glimpsed showed over $300,000 in investments over 5 years. Money that could have secured Dad's retirement instead poured into Mark's bottomless pit of failure. Meanwhile, I'd been building TechFlow solutions in complete secrecy, knowing that any hint of my ambitions would be met with the same patronizing skepticism that had defined my childhood. The AI software we developed wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. Our pattern recognition algorithms could predict market trends with 94% accuracy, and 3 Fortune 500 companies were already in bidding wars for exclusive licensing rights. The seed funding contract in my purse represented validation from Wellington Ventures, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious firms. James Morrison himself had flown out to meet with me, spending 3 hours grilling our team about the technology before declaring it the most promising AI application I've seen in 20 years. The $2 million was just the beginning. Our projections showed potential revenue streams that would make Mark's consulting dreams look like pocket change. Tonight, surrounded by the familiar chorus of Mark's praise and my own diminished expectations, I felt the weight of those years of being overlooked. But in less than 5 minutes, when James walked through that door, the golden child's crown would finally slip. And this time, there would be no Dad to catch it for him. TechFlow Solutions began in the cramped 1-bedroom apartment I shared with 2 roommates, born from frustration and fueled by determination. The incorporation papers, filed 18 months ago, listed me as CEO and founder, titles that would have sent Dad into fits of laughter if he'd known. Sarah Mitchell, the family disappointment, running a technology company? The same Sarah who couldn't even get a real job after college? The irony was that my computer science degree, the one Dad had dismissed as too nerdy, had given me the foundation to recognize a gap in the market that seasoned executives were missing. While everyone was focused on flashy consumer apps and social media platforms, I saw the untapped potential in predictive analytics for financial markets. The algorithms I'd started developing in my senior year could process vast amounts of market data and identify patterns that human analysts missed entirely. Building the company in secret had required careful choreography. During family dinners, I'd nod along when Dad asked about my temp jobs, never mentioning that I was actually working as a freelance consultant for 3 different startups while developing my own technology. When Mark bragged about his latest business venture, I'd bite my tongue instead of mentioning that my company's monthly revenue was already exceeding his annual projections. The breakthrough came 8 months ago, when I connected with Elena Rodriguez, a former Google engineer who'd been developing complementary machine learning algorithms. We met at a coffee shop in downtown, both of us exhausted from our day jobs, but energized by the possibility of creating something revolutionary. Elena had the distributed computing expertise that my algorithms needed to scale. I had the financial, market knowledge that her technology needed to find purpose. Within 3 months, we'd recruited David Chen, a former Goldman Sachs quantitative analyst who'd grown disillusioned with Wall Street's short-term thinking. David brought the financial industry credibility that venture capitalists demanded, plus a network of potential clients who were hungry for more sophisticated market analysis tools. Our three-person team worked nights and weekends, communicating through encrypted channels and meeting in coffee shops like Cold War spies. The technology itself was elegant in its complexity. We'd trained neural networks on decades of market data, teaching them to recognize patterns that preceded major market movements. But unlike traditional algorithmic trading systems, our AI could explain its reasoning, providing transparency that regulatory bodies demanded and clients craved. We weren't just predicting what would happen, we were showing why it would happen. Keeping the company's secret from my family required constant vigilance. I'd learned to code switch between Sarah, the struggling temp worker, and Sarah, the tech CEO, seamlessly. When Dad called during board meetings, I'd step outside and complain about difficult assignments that didn't exist. When family gatherings required my presence, I'd schedule around investor meetings and product demos. My phone had two separate calendars, one labeled real life and another labeled family fantasy. The financial success had been the hardest part to hide. Our first paying client, a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago, had paid us $50,000 for a 3-month pilot program. The money felt surreal after years of scraping together rent payments, but I couldn't celebrate openly. Instead, I'd deposited the check and continued eating ramen noodles, maintaining the fiction that I was barely getting by. By month 6, we had 3 clients and had proven our algorithm's effectiveness with consistent returns that outperformed market indices by significant margins. Word spread quietly through the tight-knit world of quantitative finance, and soon we were fielding inquiries from companies we'd only dreamed of working with. The referrals led to bigger clients, bigger contracts, and bigger validation that we'd built something genuinely valuable. The venture capital interest had started 3 months ago, when David's former colleague at Goldman mentioned our work to James Morrison at Wellington Ventures. James had initially been skeptical. 3 unknown founders with a company that barely existed on paper. But our performance metrics spoke for themselves. The due diligence process had been intense, involving technical audits, market analysis, and background checks that I'd worried might expose my deception to my family. Now, standing in this banquet hall, listening to Dad's dismissive comments about my career prospects, I felt the weight of that secret empire in my purse. The incorporation papers represented more than just a business. They represented proof that I'd been systematically underestimated by the people who should have believed in me most. Tonight, that underestimation would finally have consequences. The phone call that broke something fundamental inside me happened 3 years ago, on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. I was graduating summa cum laude from the computer science program at State University, ready to walk across that stage and receive recognition for 4 years of relentless work. My parents had promised to attend. Dad had even requested time off from work, marking it on the family calendar with unusual ceremony. I called Dad the morning of graduation, excited despite myself, hoping to coordinate our meeting spot after the ceremony. The recorded conversation, which I'd kept on my phone like evidence of a crime, still made my stomach clench when I accidentally heard it. "Hey Dad, just wanted to confirm what time you'll be arriving for graduation today." "Oh, Sarah, about that." The tone in his voice immediately told me everything I needed to know. "Mark's got this important client meeting this afternoon, and he asked if I could drive him to the airport. You understand, right? His business is at a crucial stage." "But, Dad, it's my graduation. You promised." "Come on, honey, it's just walking across a stage. You'll get your diploma either way." Mark's meeting could determine the future of his consulting firm. I'd stood there in my cap and gown, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something fundamental crack inside my chest. "Just walking across a stage," he'd said, as if 4 years of academic excellence, as if graduating at the top of my class, as if everything I'd worked for was just ceremonial theater. "I guess I understand," I'd lied, my voice somehow steady despite the storm raging inside me. "That's my girl. You've always been so reasonable. We'll celebrate later, I promise." Later never came. Mark's client meeting ran long, turned into dinner, then drinks, then Mark needed to be picked up from the airport the next morning because his rental car had issues. There was always something more important, someone else's needs taking precedence over acknowledging my achievements. I'd walked across that stage alone, my section of empty seats a glaring reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy. My roommate Jessica had attended instead, cheering loudly enough for a whole family when they called my name. After the ceremony, she'd taken me out for a dinner I couldn't afford, listening patiently while I finally voiced the truth I'd been avoiding for years. My family didn't believe in me because they'd never bothered to see who I actually was. That night, in my tiny apartment with my diploma propped against a stack of unpaid bills, I'd made two decisions that would define the next 3 years of my life. First, I would prove my worth through actions rather than words, building something so undeniably successful that even Dad couldn't dismiss it. Second, I would stop expecting emotional support from people who'd already shown me exactly where their priorities lay. The decision had been liberating and isolating in equal measure. I'd stopped calling home every week, stopped sharing my struggles and small victories, stopped hoping that this time would be different. When Dad asked about my career prospects during family gatherings, I'd give vague answers and redirect the conversation to Mark's latest venture. When relatives made comments about my delayed launch into adulthood, I'd smile politely and change the subject. But the anger never fully disappeared. It transformed into something colder and more focused, a determination to succeed not just for my own satisfaction, but to force a reckoning with the people who'd written me off. Every late-night coding session, every rejected proposal, every small breakthrough in my algorithm development was fueled by the memory of empty chairs at my graduation ceremony. The emotional cost had been significant. I'd built walls around my achievements, celebrating milestones alone rather than risk disappointment from the people whose approval I'd once craved. When TechFlow Solutions landed its first major client, I'd opened a bottle of cheap champagne by myself in my apartment, toasting to an empty room because there was no one I trusted enough to share the victory with. 3 years later, standing in this banquet hall, listening to Dad's casual dismissal of my life, I felt that same crack in my chest from graduation day. But this time, I wasn't powerless. This time, I had proof that their assessment of me had been not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. The recorded phone call on my device wasn't just evidence of Dad's misplaced priorities. It was documentation of the moment I'd decided to stop seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. Tonight, that decision would finally pay dividends. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because they needed to confront the consequences of their blindness. The breaking point that had driven me to build TechFlow Solutions in secret was about to become the turning point that forced my family to see me clearly for the first time in my life. The bank statement that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning exactly 1 year ago, showing a balance that I had to read 3 times to believe: $847,000. My personal investment in TechFlow Solutions had grown from my initial $5,000 savings to a portfolio that exceeded most people's lifetime earnings. Yet I still lived in the same cramped apartment, still drove the same beat-up Toyota, still let my family believe I was struggling to make ends meet. Building the company while maintaining the fiction of financial struggle required elaborate deception. The $500,000 I'd personally invested in TechFlow came from consulting contracts I'd completed under various freelance aliases, work that my family attributed to temp agencies and odd jobs. When Dad asked why I couldn't afford a nicer apartment, I'd shrug and mention how expensive rent had gotten, neglecting to mention that my checking account could have covered a year's rent on a luxury condo. The 18-month journey from concept to funded startup had been a masterclass in strategic patience. While Mark burned through Dad's money with flashy marketing campaigns and expensive office leases, I'd built TechFlow in coffee shops and shared workspaces, investing every dollar into the technology itself rather than appearances. Our first office was a converted storage room in a business incubator, furnished with second-hand desks and equipment I'd bought through online auctions. Elena, David, and I had developed a rhythm that felt like choreographed rebellion. We'd meet for study groups that were actually board meetings, discuss theoretical projects that were actually client implementations, and celebrate academic milestones that were actually revenue targets. Our communication happened through encrypted messaging apps, our file sharing through secure servers that left no trace on personal devices that family members might see. The technical challenges had been immense but exhilarating. Training our neural networks required processing power that cost thousands of dollars per month in cloud computing fees, money I justified to myself as tuition for the real-world MBA program my family would never have supported. We'd work in shifts around our day jobs, Elena handling the morning optimization runs from her Google office, David running evening backtests from his Goldman Sachs desk, and me debugging integration issues during lunch breaks from whatever freelance gig I was using as cover. The breakthrough that attracted serious investor attention came during a particularly brutal all-nighter 6 months ago. I'd been troubleshooting a pattern recognition issue that was causing our algorithms to miss crucial market signals, surviving on energy drinks and the stubborn conviction that the solution was just one more iteration away. At 4:47 a.m., exhausted and ready to abandon the problem until morning, I'd made a random adjustment to our weighting parameters. The results were extraordinary. Our modified algorithm didn't just identify the pattern we'd been hunting. It revealed 3 additional patterns that predicted market movements with unprecedented accuracy. In the span of 8 hours, we'd gone from having a promising product to having something that could revolutionize quantitative trading. Elena called it our miracle night, but I knew it was just the result of 18 months of systematic preparation meeting one moment of inspired improvisation. Recruiting our first clients had required a delicate balance of confidence and humility. We couldn't afford traditional marketing or sales teams, so we'd relied on David's network and the power of our performance metrics to generate word-of-mouth referrals. Our pitch presentations happened in borrowed conference rooms and hotel lobbies, with me wearing the same black blazer to every meeting, because it was the only professional outfit I owned that didn't show wear from my actual temp jobs. The financial success had been both validating and terrifying. Each client payment represented proof that our technology worked, but also increased the stakes for maintaining secrecy. I'd opened separate bank accounts under my legal name, but with different address information, creating a financial paper trail that existed parallel to my family's understanding of my life. Tax season had been particularly stressful, requiring creative accounting to explain income sources without revealing the true scope of my business activities. The team we'd built around TechFlow felt more like family than my actual family. Elena and David knew about my background, understood why I needed to keep the company secret, and never pressured me to resolve the deception before I was ready. They'd covered for me during family emergencies, adjusted meeting schedules around family obligations I couldn't avoid, and celebrated our victories with the understanding that I couldn't share the news with anyone else in my life. The personal cost of living this double life had been significant but worthwhile. I'd missed family gatherings to attend investor meetings, declined invitations to social events to work on product development, and maintained friendships through careful omission, rather than honest communication. But every sacrifice had been in service of something larger than immediate gratification. The chance to prove definitively that my family's assessment of my potential had been not just wrong, but absurdly, tragically wrong. Standing in this banquet hall, listening to Dad's dismissive comments while holding documentation of my secret empire, I felt the weight of those 18 months of careful deception. The bank statement in my purse wasn't just proof of financial success, it was evidence that I'd built something extraordinary, while the people who should have supported me were busy supporting someone else's failures. Tonight, the shadows I'd been building in would finally give way to light. The investment term sheet from Wellington Ventures arrived on a Thursday that I'll never forget, delivered by courier to my apartment with the kind of ceremonial weight that life-changing documents deserve. James Morrison's signature was bold and confident at the bottom of pages that valued TechFlow Solutions at $12 million pre-money, a number that made me sit down hard on my kitchen floor and stare at the ceiling for 20 minutes. $2 million in Series A funding wasn't just money. It was validation from one of Silicon Valley's most respected venture capital firms. James had explained during our final negotiation call that Wellington typically invested in companies with proven track records and established management teams. "You're an anomaly, Sarah," he'd said with a chuckle. "A profitable AI company that nobody's heard of, run by a founder who works harder than CEOs with 10 times your resources." We're betting on your potential to scale this brilliance. The patent approval had been the catalyst that transformed investor interest from polite curiosity to competitive urgency. Our core algorithm, officially titled Dynamic Pattern Recognition, for financial market prediction using adaptive neural networks, represented 3 years of innovations that no competitor could easily replicate. The patent office's approval had taken 8 months and cost more in legal fees than I'd made in the previous year. But it created intellectual property moats that made TechFlow genuinely defensible. The breakthrough had come during a client presentation. 3 weeks ago, we'd been demonstrating our technology to the investment committee at Meridian Capital, a hedge fund managing $8 billion in assets. Their chief technology officer, a former MIT professor named Dr. Elizabeth Wang, had spent 2 hours trying to break our algorithms with edge cases and stress tests. At the end of the session, she'd leaned back in her chair and said something that still gave me chills. This isn't just good technology. This is technology that will redefine how quantitative analysis works. Meridian's subsequent contract offer had been extraordinary. $3 million annually for exclusive access to our algorithms in their specific market segments. The deal would have guaranteed TechFlow's profitability for years, but James had convinced me to think bigger. You could take the safe money, he'd argued, or you could take venture funding and build something that changes the entire industry. Meridian will still be there in 6 months, but this window for explosive growth won't be. The internal conflict about revealing my success to my family had reached a breaking point during the patent application process. Legal documents required my real name, real address, and real background information that any curious family member could have discovered with a simple Google search. I'd lived in constant anxiety that Dad would stumble across a news article or industry publication that mentioned TechFlow Solutions and its mysterious young founder. The decision to keep the secret had been reinforced every time I witnessed Mark's latest business failures. His consulting firm had lost 2 major clients in the past month, both citing inconsistent service delivery and failure to meet promised outcomes. Yet Dad continued to praise Mark's entrepreneurial spirit while dismissing my career prospects. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Dad was funding documented failure while ignoring documented success happening right under his nose. Planning. The perfect moment for revelation had become an obsession. I'd considered dramatic options, showing up to family dinner in a Tesla, casually mentioning a business trip to Silicon Valley, or having Elena call during Sunday brunch, pretending to be a recruiter with an irresistible job offer. But each scenario felt petty rather than powerful. I wanted the truth to emerge organically, in a context where its impact would be undeniable. Dad's retirement party had presented the perfect opportunity. The entire extended family would be present, creating maximum witnesses to both his dismissive comments and the subsequent revelation. James's agreement to attend the party had been the final piece of the puzzle. Having a respected venture capitalist publicly acknowledge my success would eliminate any possibility that family members could rationalize or minimize what TechFlow had achieved. The psychological preparation had been as important as the logistical planning. I'd spent weeks mentally rehearsing the moment, imagining Dad's facial expressions, anticipating family members' reactions, and preparing responses to the inevitable questions about why I'd kept the secret. The anger I'd carried for years was finally crystallizing into something more productive. Not revenge, exactly, but correction. A public adjustment to a narrative that had been wrong for too long. Standing in this banquet hall with the term sheet in my purse, I felt the weight of transformation approaching like a gathering storm. The turning tide wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about forcing a reckoning with people who'd systematically underestimated someone they should have known better than anyone. In less than 5 minutes, when James walked through that door, the careful fiction of my failure would collapse, and the truth of my success would finally have room to breathe. The retirement party program arrived in my email the night before the event, sent by my well-meaning mother who wanted to make sure I knew the schedule. What I found in that innocent PDF shattered any remaining illusions I'd harbored about my father's perception of his children. The program included excerpts from Dad's planned speech, a section titled Reflections on Family Legacy, that made my blood run cold. I've been blessed with 2 children who've taught me different lessons about life. the excerpt read. My son Mark has shown me the importance of ambition and entrepreneurship, building a successful consulting business that serves clients across 3 states. He's everything I hope to pass on to the next generation: drive, intelligence, and the courage to take calculated risks in pursuit of success. The paragraph about me was shorter and devastating. My daughter Sarah has taught me about resilience and the importance of accepting life's limitations. While she's still finding her path, I admire her persistence in the face of challenges. Not everyone can be a high achiever, and there's dignity in making the best of whatever opportunities life provides. I'd read those words sitting on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, the cursor blinking in my email draft box as I struggled to process the casual cruelty of that assessment. Making the best of whatever opportunities life provides. As if my computer science degree, my technological innovations, my rapidly growing company were just lucky accidents rather than the result of systematic effort and exceptional talent. The emotional preparation for confronting that level of dismissal had required every ounce of strength I'd built over 3 years of proving myself in secret. I'd printed the program excerpt and pinned it to my bulletin board next to the Wellington Ventures term sheet, creating a visual reminder of the gap between perception and reality that tomorrow's revelation would finally bridge. Sleep had been impossible. I'd spent the night alternating between fury and sadness, reviewing every family interaction through the lens of Dad's written assessment of my limitations, the graduation he'd missed, the achievements he'd minimized, the constant comparisons to Mark's supposed success. All of it suddenly made perfect sense. Dad wasn't just favoring Mark. He was genuinely convinced that I was fundamentally less capable than my brother. The morning of the party, I'd called James to confirm his arrival time and rehearse our coordination. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he'd asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who understood the emotional stakes involved. "Once this happens, there's no going back. Your family dynamics will change permanently." "They need to change," I'd replied, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. "I've spent 3 years building something extraordinary, while they've spent 3 years funding mediocrity. Tonight, everyone gets to confront the consequences of their assumptions." Getting dressed for the party had felt like preparing for battle. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, the same black dress I'd worn to my college graduation, the one I'd bought with money from my grocery store job because my parents had been too busy with Mark's crisis of the week to help me shop for the ceremony they'd later skip. The symbolism felt appropriate. The girl they'd overlooked was about to command the attention they'd never voluntarily given. The drive to the banquet hall had been surreal, my car filled with artifacts of my double life, the TechFlow solutions. Business cards in my purse, the Wellington Ventures contract in my briefcase, the printed emails from clients praising our algorithm's performance tucked into my jacket pocket. Each document represented proof that Dad's assessment of my limitations had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. Arriving early had been strategic. I'd wanted to observe the room setup, to see the retirement display Mom had created with photos spanning Dad's 40-year career. The centerpiece was a poster-sized photo of Dad and Mark at last year's Chamber of Commerce dinner, both of them beaming in matching tuxedos at an event celebrating young entrepreneurs. Mark had been recognized for his consulting firm's community impact, an award that was particularly ironic given what I knew about his business's actual performance. The guest list represented a comprehensive audience for tonight's revelation. Dad's colleagues from the engineering firm, extended family members who'd watched Mark and me grow up, family friends who'd heard years of updates about Mark's successes and Sarah's struggles. These were people whose opinions mattered to Dad, whose reactions would carry weight in ways that private conversations never could. Standing in that decorated banquet hall, reading Dad's printed assessment of my limitations while carrying documentation of achievements he couldn't imagine, I felt the weight of years of misunderstanding crystallizing into a single moment of truth. Tonight wasn't about revenge, it was about correction. A public adjustment to a narrative that had been poisoning family relationships for far too long. The program in my purse felt like evidence in a trial where I was simultaneously the prosecutor, the defendant, and the key witness. In less than an hour, Dad would deliver his speech about my limitations to a room full of people who were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong his assessment had been. Dad's speech began exactly as the program had promised, but hearing those words spoken aloud to a room full of people made them infinitely more devastating than reading them on paper. I'd positioned myself near the back of the banquet hall, close. Enough to hear every word, but far enough away to observe the audience's reactions without becoming the center of attention before my moment arrived. Family has always been the cornerstone of my life, Dad said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his own judgment. Tonight, I want to share some thoughts about the next generation and what they've taught me. About success, perseverance, and accepting life's realities. The live recording I'd started on my phone captured every nuance of what happened next. The pride in Dad's voice when he described Mark's entrepreneurial vision. The subtle shift to patronizing sympathy when he turned to discussing my journey of self-discovery. The audience's responses were equally telling. Enthusiastic nods for Mark's accomplishments, uncomfortable shifts, and sympathetic smiles for my supposed struggles. Mark has built something remarkable with his consulting firm, Dad continued, gesturing toward my brother who stood near the front of the room, basking in familiar praise. 3 states, dozens of clients, innovative approaches to business development. He reminds me of myself at that age, hungry, ambitious, unafraid to take risks. Watching him succeed has been one of the greatest joys of my career. The applause was genuine and sustained. Cousin Jennifer leaned over to whisper something to Aunt Linda, both of them beaming with family pride. Uncle Robert raised his wine glass in a small salute to Mark, who acknowledged the gesture with practiced humility. This was the Mark they all knew, the golden child whose success reflected well on the entire family's gene pool. Then Dad's tone shifted, becoming gentler, but somehow more condescending. Sarah has taught me different lessons about resilience and character. Not everyone is destined for traditional success, and there's real wisdom in learning to bloom where you're planted. The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to sound supportive while actually diminishing everything I'd achieved. She's still finding her path, bouncing between opportunities, but I admire her persistence. Sarah reminds us that life isn't a competition, that there are many ways to contribute to the world beyond entrepreneurship and high achievement. The pause he took before continuing felt like an eternity. Sometimes the greatest courage is simply accepting your limitations and making peace with a simpler life. The audience's reaction was a masterclass in polite discomfort. Sympathetic nods replaced enthusiastic applause, and I caught several people stealing glances in my direction with expressions that mixed pity with relief that their own children hadn't turned out so disappointing. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was fighting back tears of sympathy for my parents' burden. Mark's response was perhaps the most telling of all. Instead of looking uncomfortable with the comparison, he actually seemed to grow taller, his chest puffing out with the kind of pride that feeds on someone else's diminishment. When a few people near him offered congratulatory handshakes, he accepted them graciously, as if Dad's speech had been a formal coronation rather than a character assassination disguised as fatherly love. The psychological impact of hearing my limitations cataloged so publicly was more intense than I'd anticipated. Despite 3 years of preparation, despite knowing exactly what Dad thought of me, having those assumptions broadcast to 50 people who'd watched me grow up felt like being flayed alive. Every sympathetic smile, every pitying glance, every subtle shift away from me as if failure might be contagious. It all reinforced the narrative that I was the family's cautionary tale. But underneath the humiliation, I felt something stronger, building, a cold, focused determination that had been forged in 18 months of secret success. The recording on my phone wasn't just evidence of Dad's cruelty. It was documentation of the exact moment when his understanding of reality became completely divorced from actual facts. In less than 2 minutes, when James Morrison walked through that door, every person in this room would have to confront the gap between Dad's assessment and the truth. The final words of Dad's speech hung in the air like a challenge. I'm proud of both my children for different reasons. Mark for reaching such heights, and Sarah for finding contentment in life's simpler pleasures. The applause was polite but scattered, the kind of response reserved for speeches that make everyone slightly uncomfortable, but that nobody wants to publicly critique. I checked my phone. 7:47 p.m. James would arrive in exactly 3 minutes, and with him would come the end of this carefully constructed fiction about my limitations. The humiliation burning in my chest was about to transform into something far more powerful. The sweet vindication of proving everyone in this room catastrophically wrong about who I really was. James Morrison walked through the banquet hall. Doors at exactly 7:50 p.m. His presence immediately shifting the energy of the room in ways that had nothing to do with my family's drama and everything to do with his reputation in the business world. At 52, James commanded attention without demanding it, the kind of quiet authority that came from 20 years of making decisions that created billion-dollar companies and launched 1,000 careers. The business card in my purse, embossed with Wellington Ventures' distinctive logo, suddenly felt like it was radiating heat. James Morrison, senior partner, the man who'd discovered 3 unicorn startups and whose investment thesis had been featured on the cover of Forbes twice in the past 5 years. The same James Morrison who'd spent 3 hours last week grilling me about market penetration strategies and competitive advantages before declaring TechFlow Solutions the most promising AI investment opportunity in the current market. Several people in the room recognized him immediately. I watched Uncle Robert's eyebrows shoot up as he whispered something urgent to Aunt Linda, both of them suddenly standing straighter as if important people demanded better posture. Dad's former colleague from the engineering firm, a man who followed tech industry news religiously, actually dropped his conversation mid-sentence to stare at the door. "Is that James Morrison?" I heard someone whisper near the appetizer table. "From Wellington Ventures? What's he doing here?" The ripple of recognition spread through the room like electricity through water. These weren't tech industry insiders, but they were educated professionals who read business magazines and followed market news. James Morrison wasn't just wealthy. He was famous for being smart about wealth, for seeing opportunities that other investors missed, for turning bold bets into legendary returns. Mark's reaction was particularly telling. I watched him Google something frantically on his phone, his face growing pale as he presumably read about James's track record and Wellington Ventures' recent portfolio companies. The golden child who'd been basking in Dad's praise moments earlier suddenly looked like someone who'd realized he was dramatically outclassed. James surveyed the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading social dynamics quickly. His gaze found mine across the crowded space, and he offered the slightest nod, our prearranged signal that he was ready to proceed with the plan we'd discussed. The plan that would transform me from family disappointment to center of attention in approximately 90 seconds. Dad, still riding the high of his speech about Mark's success and my limitations, noticed the commotion but hadn't yet connected the dots. He was shaking hands with well-wishers near the podium, accepting congratulations on his retirement and compliments about his children, specifically compliments about Mark and sympathetic comments about his patience with me. "Excuse me," James said, approaching the small cluster of people surrounding Dad. His voice carried easily across the room, despite its conversational volume. "I'm looking for Sarah Mitchell. I believe she's here tonight?" The question landed like a depth charge in still water. Every conversation in the room paused as people processed the implications of James Morrison asking for Sarah Mitchell by name, not asking for Mark, the successful entrepreneur, not asking for Dad, the retiring executive, asking specifically for me, the family member whose limitations had just been cataloged in loving detail for the entire room. Dad's confusion was written across his face in bold letters. "Sarah? You're looking for my daughter Sarah?" The disbelief in his voice was so complete that it almost sounded like he was questioning whether I actually existed. "Yes, Sarah Mitchell, CEO of TechFlow Solutions. We have some business to discuss." James delivered the words with the casual authority of someone stating obvious facts, but their impact on the room was seismic. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ice machine cycling in the kitchen. 50 people simultaneously processing information that didn't fit their understanding of reality, their mental models of the Mitchell family dynamics suddenly requiring dramatic recalibration. Mark's phone actually slipped from his hands, clattering onto the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned quiet. Dad's mouth opened and closed without producing words, like a fish trying to breathe air. The extended family members who'd been offering sympathetic smiles about my limitations just moments before now looked like they were experiencing collective cognitive dissonance. I stepped forward from my position near the back of the room, feeling every eye in the room tracking my movement. "That would be me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Sorry I'm late, James. Family obligations, you understand." The casual familiarity with which I addressed one of Silicon Valley's most respected investors sent another shockwave through the room. These people had just heard a detailed speech about my inability to achieve traditional success, followed immediately by evidence that I was somehow personally acquainted with someone whose investment decisions made headlines in the Wall Street Journal. James smiled with the warmth of someone genuinely pleased to see a valued business partner. "No problem at all, Sarah. Congratulations, by the way. The final documents came through this afternoon. Wellington Ventures is officially excited to be part of TechFlow's next chapter." The room remained frozen in tableau, 50 people holding their breath while their understanding of reality underwent fundamental reconstruction. In the space of 2 minutes, I'd gone from family disappointment to someone important enough to command James Morrison's personal attention. The cognitive whiplash was almost visible on their faces. The signed partnership agreement that James pulled from his briefcase wasn't just a document. It was a weapon of mass assumption destruction. The pages were crisp and official, bearing the Wellington Ventures letterhead that commanded respect in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. But more importantly, they contained numbers that would shatter every preconception this room held about my capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to addressing rooms full of skeptics. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I wanted to personally deliver some exciting news about one of our portfolio companies." His smile was genuine as he looked around the room, reading the confusion on every face with obvious amusement. TechFlow Solutions, founded and led by Sarah Mitchell, has just closed a Series A funding round that values the company at $12 million pre-money. Wellington Ventures is proud to lead this investment with $2 million in growth capital. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, their meaning slowly penetrating the shocked silence that had engulfed the banquet hall. Dad's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so tragic. Confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something approaching panic as he began to grasp the implications of what he was hearing. The daughter whose limitations he'd just finished cataloging for the entire room was apparently running a company worth more money than he'd made in his entire 40-year career. Sarah's artificial intelligence algorithms represent breakthrough. "Technology in predictive market analysis," James continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a particularly promising racehorse. "We've rarely seen technology with such immediate commercial applications and such strong intellectual property protection. The patent portfolio alone is worth millions." Mark's reaction was perhaps the most telling of all. I watched my golden child brother struggle to process information that completely inverted our family's hierarchy of success. His consulting firm, the source of so much paternal pride, might generate a few $100,000 in annual revenue on a good year. My secret company had just been valued at $12 million by one of the world's most respected venture capital firms. The extended family members who'd been nodding sympathetically during Dad's speech about my limitations now looked like they were experiencing collective whiplash. Cousin Jennifer, who'd patronizingly assured me that I'd figure it out eventually, stared at me with an expression of dawning horror as she realized she'd been condescending to someone who could have bought her house with pocket change. "The partnership agreement we're announcing tonight," James said, pulling additional documents from his briefcase with theatrical timing, "involves an exclusive licensing deal with Meridian Capital Management. They'll be paying TechFlow Solutions $3 million annually for access to our algorithms in their quantitative trading operations. $3 million annually. The number reverberated through the room like a physical force, striking down assumptions and rebuilding understanding in real time. I watched Uncle Robert's wine glass actually shake in his hand as he processed the mathematical reality of what he was hearing. But James wasn't finished. "What makes this particularly impressive," he continued, his tone shifting to something approaching reverence, is that Sarah built this company entirely through bootstrapping and personal investment. No family money, no inherited advantages, just pure technological innovation and business acumen. It's exactly the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that Wellington Ventures exists to support. The irony was so thick, it could have been cut with a knife. Dad had spent years pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into Mark's failing ventures, while his actually successful child had been building something extraordinary without asking for a penny of family support. The very independence that Dad had interpreted as evidence of my limitations had actually been the foundation of my success. "Sarah," James said, turning to me with a smile that contained just enough mischief to suggest he was enjoying this revelation as much as I was. "Would you like to say a few words about TechFlow's vision for the future?" The room turned to me, with an attention I'd never experienced from this particular audience. These weren't polite smiles or sympathetic glances. This was the focused attention reserved for people whose words might actually matter. For the first time in my life, my family was looking at me as if my opinions might be worth hearing. "Thank you, James," I said, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the moment. Building TechFlow has been the most challenging and rewarding experience of my life. What started as a personal project to develop better market prediction algorithms has evolved into something that could genuinely change how financial institutions approach quantitative analysis. I paused, looking directly at Dad, whose face had gone through so many emotional transitions that it now resembled a confused topographical map. The technology we've developed can process vast amounts of market data and identify patterns that human analysts miss entirely. Our current clients are seeing returns that exceed market indices by significant margins, which is why the interest from investors and potential partners has been so intense. The partnership agreement in James's hands represented more than just money. It represented validation from institutions that my family had always respected, but never imagined they'd be connected to. Wellington Ventures, Meridian Capital, the Patent Office, the Fortune 500 companies bidding for licensing rights. All of them had looked at my work and seen value that my own family had been blind to for years. The transformation in the room's energy was palpable. Conversations that had been patronizing me moments before were now scrambling to recalibrate. People suddenly remembering times they'd always believed in my potential, or known I was destined for something special. The revisionist history was already beginning, but I was too focused on Dad's reaction to be bothered by the family members who were suddenly discovering they'd always been my biggest supporters. The consequences of James's revelation rippled through the banquet hall like aftershocks from an earthquake, each new piece of information causing fresh damage to the carefully constructed mythology of the Mitchell family dynamics. But it was the arrival of Rebecca Chen, investigative journalist for Business Weekly, that transformed personal embarrassment into potential public catastrophe. I hadn't invited Rebecca. Her appearance was purely coincidental, the result of her investigating a completely unrelated story about retirement trends in the engineering sector. But her presence at the exact moment when my family's assumptions were being demolished felt like cosmic justice with a sense of timing. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, approaching our small cluster near the entrance. "I'm Rebecca Chen from Business Weekly. I'm here to interview some retirees for a feature article, but I couldn't help overhearing something about TechFlow Solutions. That's the AI company that's been making waves in the financial sector, isn't it?" James nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Right. Sarah here is the founder and CEO, brilliant young entrepreneur, revolutionizing predictive analytics." His pride was genuine, the kind of professional admiration that couldn't be faked or bought. Rebecca's journalistic instincts immediately kicked into high gear. "Sarah Mitchell? The same Sarah Mitchell who developed the patent-pending algorithm that's been causing such excitement among quantitative analysts?" She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be extensive research notes. "I've been following TechFlow's story for months. The industry buzz has been incredible. The draft article that Rebecca showed me on her phone made my stomach drop. Not because it was negative, but because it was scheduled for publication in next week's issue with the headline, 'The Anonymous Genius, How a 29-Year-Old Dropout is Disrupting Wall Street.' The subhead was even more problematic. Sarah Mitchell's Tech Flow Solutions proves that traditional business education can't compete with raw innovation. Dropout? Dad's voice cracked as he read over my shoulder. What do they mean, dropout? Rebecca looked confused. I'm sorry. I thought you were family. Sarah's story is fascinating. Graduating summa cum laude from computer science, then choosing to skip traditional corporate careers to build something revolutionary from scratch. It's exactly the kind of contrarian thinking that creates breakthrough companies. The correction hit the room like a second wave of cognitive restructuring. Not only was I not the limitation-accepting underachiever Dad had described, but I was actually the subject of business magazine articles about unconventional success. The narrative whiplash was visible on every face in the room. Mark's own unraveling began in that moment, his carefully maintained facade cracking under the pressure of having his sister suddenly revealed as a legitimate tech industry success story. I watched him excuse himself to make a phone call, but his voice carried clearly from the hallway as he frantically tried to coordinate damage control with his business partner. How were we supposed to know? I heard him saying. She's been pretending to be broke for 3 years. Now she's worth millions, and there's going to be a magazine article? This makes my consulting firm look like amateur hour. The irony was that Mark's consulting firm had always been amateur hour. The magazine article was just making that fact impossible to ignore. His client list, which Dad had praised so enthusiastically during his speech, consisted primarily of small businesses that paid modest fees for basic services that any competent recent graduate could provide. Compared to TechFlow's Fortune 500 partnerships and million-dollar licensing deals, Mark's accomplishments revealed themselves as the participation trophies they'd always been. Rebecca's research was thorough and devastating. She pulled up market analysis reports that quoted TechFlow's performance metrics, patent filings that demonstrated the sophistication of our technology, and client testimonials that painted a picture of a company at the forefront of financial innovation. Each piece of evidence drove another nail into the coffin of Dad's assessment of my limitations. The venture capital community has been buzzing about TechFlow for months, Rebecca explained to the gathered crowd, which had grown as word spread through the banquet hall that something extraordinary was happening. Wellington Ventures doesn't typically invest in companies this early, but Sarah's technology represents such a significant breakthrough that they made an exception. The extended family members who'd been offering sympathetic comments about my struggles just 20 minutes earlier were now scrambling to position themselves as early believers in my success. Aunt Linda actually claimed she'd always known Sarah was special, while Uncle Robert suddenly remembered encouraging her interest in computers during family gatherings. I was certain he'd barely attended. But the most telling reaction came from the business community representatives who'd attended Dad's retirement party. These were people who understood what venture capital investments actually meant, who recognized the significance of patent portfolios and Fortune 500 partnerships. Their respectful attention wasn't the polite courtesy they'd shown during Dad's speech. It was the genuine interest reserved for people whose opinions might actually influence their own business decisions. The psychological impact on Dad was becoming increasingly visible. I watched him struggle to reconcile 3 years of assumptions about my career trajectory with the mounting evidence that I'd been systematically more successful than his golden child. The man who'd skipped my college graduation to help Mark with a business crisis was learning that he'd prioritized documented failure over revolutionary success. Rebecca's final question was the one that would haunt family dynamics for months to come. Sarah, what's next for TechFlow Solutions? I understand there are already discussions about international expansion and additional funding rounds. The implications hung in the air like a challenge to everything this room had believed about the Mitchell family hierarchy. Not only had I built something extraordinary in secret, but I was apparently just getting started. The daughter whose limitations had been lovingly catalogued in Dad's retirement speech was positioned to become more successful than anyone in the family had ever imagined possible. Mark's return from his damage control phone call coincided perfectly with Rebecca's question about TechFlow's future. His face was ashen, his golden child confidence replaced by the dawning realization that he'd spent 3 years being praised for accomplishments that paled in comparison to his sister's hidden achievements. The private confrontation happened in the banquet hall's side conference room, where Dad had retreated after the crowd's attention became too overwhelming. I found him sitting alone at a small table, staring at the family financial records he'd pulled from his briefcase. Documents that now told a very different story than they had an hour earlier. The spreadsheet open on his laptop showed 5 years of investments in Mark's ventures. $47,000 for initial consulting firm setup, $23,000 for marketing materials and office equipment, $89,000 to cover operating losses during temporary market downturns, $67,000 for the expansion into new service territories, and another $94,000 for what Mark had called strategic pivots, but which the records revealed as desperate attempts to stop hemorrhaging money. $320,000, Dad said without looking up from the screen. His voice was hollow, carrying the weight of someone who'd just discovered that their fundamental understanding of reality had been catastrophically wrong. I invested $320,000 in Mark's consulting business over 5 years. I sat down across from him, noting how much older he looked than he had during his speech just an hour earlier. I know, I said simply. I've seen the financial records. You've seen them? The surprise in his voice was genuine. How? I help Mom with the tax preparation sometimes. She's been worried about the drain on your retirement fund. I kept my voice neutral, factual. This wasn't the moment for accusations. This was the moment for truth. The payments to Mark's business have been increasing every year, even as his client base has been shrinking. Dad's hands shook slightly as he scrolled through more entries. The documentation was damning. Payment after payment to cover Mark's business expenses, personal loans that had never been repaid, emergency investments that had never generated returns. The golden child's success had been funded entirely by Dad's retirement savings and equity from the family home. While I was giving him hundreds of thousands of dollars, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, you were building $1 million company with your own money. $12 million company, I corrected gently. And yes, I bootstrapped it entirely. Every dollar I invested came from freelance consulting work that I did in addition to whatever temp jobs I told you about. The silence stretched between us like a chasm filled with years of missed opportunities and misplaced priorities. Dad's careful tracking of Mark's expenses sat on the screen like evidence in a trial where he was simultaneously the judge, jury, and defendant. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out as part accusation, part plea. If you were building something this significant, why keep it secret? I pulled out my phone and played the recorded conversation from my college graduation. The call where he'd canceled attending my ceremony to help Mark with a client meeting. Dad's voice from 3 years ago filled the small conference room, dismissing my graduation as just walking across a stage while prioritizing Mark's business crisis. Because you made it clear that my achievements weren't worth your time, I said, stopping the recording after his comment about Mark's meeting being more important than my ceremony. I learned to stop expecting support from someone who'd already shown me exactly where his priorities lay. Dad's face went through several expressions as he processed the implications of hearing his own voice dismiss what he now knew had been the graduation of a future tech entrepreneur. The cognitive dissonance was written across his features in stark detail. The man who'd skipped his daughter's academic triumph to support his son's business failures. The graduation, he said slowly, memory clearly reassembling that day from a new perspective. You were graduating summa cum laude with a computer science degree that led to all of this, and I chose to help Mark with a client meeting instead. A client meeting for a business that was already failing, I confirmed. According to your records, Mark's consulting firm lost that client 2 months later due to service delivery issues. The meeting you prioritized over my graduation was ultimately pointless. The cruelty of the mathematics was inescapable. Dad had sacrificed meaningful moments with his successful child to support the failures of his unsuccessful one. Every family dinner spent praising Mark's entrepreneurial spirit. Every holiday conversation focused on his latest venture. Every birthday celebration where Mark's achievements overshadowed my presence. All of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of which child was actually succeeding. The fake MBA diploma, I said, pulling out the photo I'd taken months earlier. Did you know it was fake? Dad's face crumpled as he examined the image. He told me he'd completed an executive program. I never questioned it because I wanted to believe he was building something real. He dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, I said, my voice carrying the weight of 3 years of suppressed frustration. Everything about his business credentials was fabricated. Meanwhile, I have a legitimate computer science degree, a patent portfolio worth millions, and a company that's being courted by Fortune 500 firms. The breakdown was happening in real time. Dad's understanding of his children, his assessment of their potential, his allocation of financial and emotional resources, all of it was revealed as not just wrong, but systematically, devastatingly wrong. He'd been funding failure while ignoring success for years. I need to make this right, he said, reaching across the table toward me. The money I gave Mark, the support I didn't give you, the assumptions I made, I need to fix this. I pulled back from his outstretched hand, not in anger, but in self-protection. You can't fix 3 years of dismissal with an apology, I said. You can't retroactively attend my graduation or take back the speech you gave tonight about my limitations. The damage has been done. Then what do you want from me? The question was plaintive, desperate. I want you to understand the consequences of your choices, I said, gathering the financial records he'd been studying. I want you to sit with the reality that you invested over $300,000 in failure while your actually successful child built something extraordinary without asking for a penny of support. I stood to leave, then turned back for one final point. The retirement fund you depleted supporting Mark's failures? TechFlow Solutions' first quarter revenue could replace that entire amount. The daughter whose limitations you cataloged tonight could have solved your financial concerns with a single wire transfer. But you never bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life. Mark's resignation letter arrived in my email at 6:23 a.m. the next morning, a hastily written document that managed to be simultaneously defensive and desperate. The subject line read, "Stepping down, family business role," but the content revealed someone grappling with the complete collapse of his carefully constructed identity. After last night's revelations, the letter began, I've realized that my role in the family business dynamics has become untenable. Sarah's success with TechFlow Solutions has exposed gaps in my own business performance that I can no longer ignore or rationalize. I'm stepping down from any advisory positions within the family financial structure, effective immediately. The admission was more honest than anything Mark had said to the family in years. His consulting firm had been hemorrhaging clients since a particularly damaging review appeared on industry forums 3 months ago, but he'd continued accepting Dad's financial support while presenting optimistic projections that bore no resemblance to reality. The contrast with TechFlow's documented success had made those deceptions impossible to maintain. The impact on extended family relationships was swift and merciless. Cousin Jennifer, who'd patronized me about blooming at different times just 12 hours earlier, sent a LinkedIn connection request at 7:15 a.m. with a message about exploring potential collaboration opportunities. Aunt Linda called Mom before 8 a.m., suddenly remembering several family gatherings where she'd always suspected Sarah was destined for something special. The revisionist history was almost comical in its transparency. Uncle Robert, who'd spent years treating me like a cautionary tale about academic overachievement, suddenly recalled encouraging my interest in technology during childhood visits that I was certain he'd barely acknowledged at the time. The same relatives who'd offered sympathetic smiles about my struggles were now competing to position themselves as early believers in my potential. But the most significant ripple effect was the transformation in family business dynamics. Dad's engineering firm had operated as an informal family enterprise, with Mark serving as an unofficial business development consultant, despite his documented failures in his own ventures. The revelation that his business acumen had been consistently wrong, while my judgment had been creating million-dollar successes, forced a complete reorganization of who the family trusted for strategic advice. The conversation I overheard between Dad and his business partner Tom crystallized the scope of the damage. "How did you not know?" Tom asked during their phone call, his voice carrying the incredulous tone of someone discovering that his trusted colleague had been systematically misreading his own children's capabilities. "Your daughter built a $12 million company in secret while you were funding your son's failures." Dad's response was painful to hear. "I thought I knew them. I thought Mark's confidence meant competence, and Sarah's quietness meant limitation. I've been catastrophically wrong about my own children for years. The professional consequences extended beyond family dynamics. Dad's colleagues at the engineering firm had attended the retirement party, witnessed the revelation, and were now questioning his judgment in ways that affected his final weeks at the company. The man who'd built a reputation for technical precision and analytical thinking had been revealed as someone who couldn't accurately assess the people closest to him. Mark's client base began evaporating as word spread through the local business community about the contrast between his promoted capabilities and his sister's demonstrated achievements. 3 clients canceled contracts within 48 hours, citing strategic realignment, but clearly motivated by the realization that they'd been paying premium rates for services from someone whose own family success story had been built by someone else entirely. The psychological impact on Mark was becoming increasingly visible during family interactions. The golden child who'd spent years basking in parental pride and extended family admiration was now forced to confront the reality that his achievements had been artificially inflated while his sister's had been systematically minimized. The confidence that had defined his personality for decades was revealed as having been built on fundamentally false premises. Rebecca Chen's article, published 3 days after the retirement party, intensified the ripple effects exponentially. The Anonymous Genius: How Sarah Mitchell Built a Financial AI Empire. While her family funded her brother's failures, became the most read business story of the week, generating thousands of shares and comments about family dynamics, gender bias, and the dangers of assuming confidence equals competence. The article included quotes from industry analysts praising TechFlow's innovation alongside sidebar comparisons of Mark's consulting firm's declining performance metrics. The juxtaposition was devastating. One Mitchell child building revolutionary technology, while the other struggled to maintain basic client relationships despite significant family financial support. Dad's retirement party, originally intended as a celebration of his career achievements, became a cautionary tale about assumption-making that circulated through professional networks far beyond our local community. Colleagues who'd attended the event found themselves questioning their own assessment abilities, wondering what obvious successes they might be overlooking while supporting more visible but less competent performers. The financial implications were staggering when calculated honestly. The $320,000 Dad had invested in Mark's failing ventures could have been seed money for TechFlow Solutions, potentially giving the family a significant ownership stake in a company now valued at $12 million. Instead, that money had disappeared into a series of failed business initiatives that had never generated sustainable returns. The measured response I maintained throughout this period wasn't magnanimity. It was strategic self-preservation. Every family member who reached out to reconnect or explore opportunities received polite but distant responses that acknowledged their contact without committing to anything substantive. The same people who dismissed my potential for years were now eager to associate themselves with my success, but I'd learned too much about their true character to trust their sudden enthusiasm. The family therapy session notes from Dr. Patricia Hoffman painted a stark picture of the psychological reconstruction required when fundamental assumptions about family dynamics prove catastrophically wrong. Mom had insisted on professional mediation after Dad's 3rd sleepless night, spent recalculating years of financial decisions and wondering aloud how he'd been so systematically wrong about his own children. The Mitchell family presents a textbook case of confirmation bias amplified by gender stereotypes, Dr. Hoffman had written in her preliminary assessment. The parents consistently interpreted confidence as competence in their son while dismissing actual achievement in their daughter. The resulting family dynamic created artificial hierarchies that bear no relationship to objective reality. The sessions themselves were exercises in controlled demolition. Week by week, we dissected decades of interactions through the lens of what Dr. Hoffman called evidence-based family dynamics. Every assumption had to be examined, every pattern questioned, every hierarchy justified by actual outcomes rather than perceived potential. Dad's struggle to adapt to the new reality was painful to witness. The man who'd built his career on analytical precision was forced to confront the reality that his analysis of his own family had been not just wrong, but consistently, systematically wrong in ways that had damaged relationships for years. His attempts to process the cognitive dissonance were visible during every session. "I keep going back to specific moments," he admitted during our fourth session, his voice carrying the weight of someone cataloging decades of mistakes. Sarah's high school science fair project that won state recognition. I barely attended because Mark had a basketball game that same weekend. Her college scholarship announcement that I celebrated for 5 minutes before asking if she planned to study something more practical than computer science. The documentation I'd brought to these sessions was comprehensive and devastating. School records showing consistent academic excellence that had been minimized or ignored. Financial records proving that I'd been self-sufficient since graduation, while Mark had required constant monetary support. Professional achievements that demonstrated competence while his ventures documented repeated failure. Mom's role in these dynamics proved more complex than simple favoritism. She'd enabled Dad's bias not through malice, but through conflict avoidance, choosing to support his assessment rather than challenge assumptions that were clearly contradicted by observable evidence. Her realization that her silence had contributed to years of family dysfunction was perhaps more painful than Dad's recognition of his active favoritism. "I knew Sarah was brilliant," Mom confessed during one particularly difficult session. "But challenging your father's view of the children felt like choosing sides, so I stayed neutral. I didn't realize that neutrality in the face of obvious injustice was actually choosing the wrong side. The boundary-setting process became the framework for any potential reconciliation. Dr. Hoffman helped me articulate conditions that would need to be met before I could consider rebuilding substantive relationships with family members who'd systematically undervalued me for years. The first boundary was acknowledgement without qualification. Any family member who wanted to rebuild our relationship would need to acknowledge their role in perpetuating dynamics that had been damaging and wrong, without explaining, justifying, or minimizing their behavior. The "I always believed in you" revisionist history was off limits. The second boundary was respect for my autonomy and judgment. Family members who'd spent years dismissing my opinions and decisions would need to demonstrate that they understood my track record of success and were prepared to treat my perspectives with appropriate respect going forward. The third boundary was financial independence. I would not become the family's solution to problems created by years of poor resource allocation. The retirement fund, depleted supporting Mark's failures, was not my responsibility to replenish, despite my technical ability to do so easily. The fourth boundary was authentic relationship building. I was willing to develop new relationships with family members based on mutual respect and genuine interest, but I would not pretend that the old dynamics had been acceptable or that they could be resumed with minor modifications. Mark's journey toward accepting these new dynamics was particularly challenging. The golden child who'd spent decades as the family's success story was forced to confront the reality that his achievements had been artificially inflated while his sisters had been systematically diminished. His attempts to process this reversal ranged from defensive anger to desperate attempts at rivalry. "How was I supposed to know she was building something this significant?" he asked during one joint session, his voice carrying the petulance of someone who felt unfairly criticized for circumstances beyond his control. "She never talked about her work, never asked for help, never gave any indication that she was creating something revolutionary." My response was measured but firm. I stopped talking about my work because my achievements were consistently dismissed or minimized. I stopped asking for help because help was never offered. I stopped giving indications about my success because the family had already decided I was the one with limitations. Dr. Hoffman's professional assessment was that genuine reconciliation would require months of sustained effort from family members who'd spent years operating from fundamentally flawed assumptions. The new normal wouldn't be a return to previous dynamics with minor adjustments. It would be a complete reconstruction of family relationships based on evidence rather than bias. The session notes documented a family system that had been functional for some members and deeply dysfunctional for others, held together by assumptions that crumbled under examination. Rebuilding would require everyone to abandon comfortable roles and develop new ways of relating that acknowledged reality rather than perpetuating convenient fictions. The most telling moment came when Dr. Hoffman asked each family member to describe the others based on observable evidence rather than historical assumptions. For the first time in decades, Dad described me accurately. Sarah is a successful entrepreneur who built a multi-million-dollar technology company through exceptional technical skills and business acumen. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he was learning to speak. Dad's handwritten apology letter arrived 3 weeks after our last therapy session, delivered not through email or text, but in the careful script of someone who'd taken hours to choose each word. The pages were covered in crossouts and revisions, evidence of multiple drafts where he'd struggled to find language adequate for the scope of what he was trying to address. "Sarah," it began, "I've spent the past month trying to understand how I became so fundamentally wrong about my own daughter. Not just mistaken, but systematically, persistently wrong in ways that damaged our relationship and denied you the support and recognition you deserved." The letter was raw in its honesty, cataloging specific moments when he'd chosen to support Mark's failures over acknowledging my successes. The graduation he'd missed, the achievements he'd minimized, the casual dismissal of my career prospects. During family gatherings, each incident was acknowledged without excuse or rationalization. "I skipped your college graduation to help Mark with a client meeting that ultimately meant nothing," he wrote. "While you were being recognized for academic excellence that predicted the success you've achieved, I was prioritizing a business crisis that exemplified the failure I was too blind to see. I cannot take back that choice, but I can acknowledge how profoundly wrong it was." The section about financial decisions was particularly painful to read. Dad had calculated the exact amounts invested in Mark's ventures versus the support offered. To me, $320,000 poured into documented failures, while his actually successful child received nothing beyond basic family obligations. The mathematics of his misplaced priorities were stark when presented without emotional buffer. "You built TechFlow Solutions without asking for a penny of family support," the letter continued. "Not because you didn't need help, but because I'd demonstrated through years of behavior that I didn't believe you were capable of achievements worth supporting. Meanwhile, I funded business ventures that any objective analysis would have revealed as unsustainable." The internal debate about forgiveness had been consuming my thoughts for weeks. The rational part of my mind understood that people could change, that relationships could be rebuilt, that holding on to anger would ultimately hurt me more than anyone else. But the emotional part of my mind remembered every dismissive comment, every missed milestone, every moment when Dad's assessment of my limitations had made me question my own worth. Dr. Hoffman had warned me that forgiveness was a process rather than a decision, something that would happen gradually through rebuilt trust rather than instant absolution through sincere apology. The letter was a necessary first step, but it couldn't erase years of feeling invisible in my own family. The conditions I'd set for rebuilding our relationship were non-negotiable and clearly stated in my response: acknowledgement of past mistakes, without qualification, respect for my autonomy and judgment going forward, recognition that rebuilding trust would require sustained behavioral change rather than symbolic gestures, and acceptance that our relationship would be fundamentally different from the patronizing dynamic that had defined it for decades. "I can't pretend that your apology erases the impact of years of being dismissed and undervalued," I wrote back, "but I'm willing to consider building a new relationship based on mutual respect and genuine understanding. This would be a relationship between equals, not between a parent who knows best and a daughter who needs guidance." The choice to give Dad a chance wasn't motivated by forgiveness. It was motivated by hope that authentic connection was still possible if both parties were willing to abandon the roles that had prevented it before. The man who'd written this letter seemed genuinely committed to understanding rather than rationalizing, to changing rather than defending. Setting clear boundaries for future interactions became the framework for any potential reconciliation. Family gatherings would no longer include casual commentary about my career prospects or comparisons between Mark's and my achievements. Financial support would flow only in directions that made sense based on actual need rather than assumed capability. Conversations would acknowledge my track record of success rather than treating my opinions as interesting but ultimately unimportant. The psychological work of rebuilding trust would require evidence over time rather than promises in the moment. Dad's letter was encouraging, but lasting change would be demonstrated through consistent behavior that respected my autonomy and recognized my competence. The daughter who'd been systematically underestimated was no longer willing to accept relationships based on false premises. Mark's parallel journey toward understanding his role in family dynamics was proceeding more slowly and defensively. His identity had been so thoroughly built on being the successful child that acknowledging my achievements felt like diminishing his own worth. The zero-sum thinking that had characterized family dynamics for years would need to be replaced with recognition that multiple people could be successful in different ways. The decision to rebuild rather than abandon family relationships wasn't about them. It was about me. I'd spent 3 years proving that I could succeed without their support or recognition, but I'd also discovered that success felt incomplete when experienced in isolation. The choice to give them opportunities to know who I actually was, rather than who they'd assumed I was, represented hope that authentic connection was still possible. The letter in my hands represented more than apology. It represented the first crack in a wall of assumptions that had separated us for decades. Whether that crack would widen into genuine understanding or be sealed over by the comfort of familiar patterns remained to be seen. But for the first time since the retirement party revelation, I felt cautiously optimistic that the family relationships I'd mourned might actually be rebuildable on better foundations. The TechFlow Solutions IPO filing arrived at the Securities and Exchange Commission on a Tuesday morning that marked exactly 18 months since Dad's retirement party revelation. The document represented more than just another business milestone. It was proof that the company built in secret while being dismissed by my own family had evolved into something that would soon be valued by public markets. Elena, David, and I had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, working with investment banks and legal teams to structure an offering that would raise the capital needed for international expansion while maintaining the innovative culture that had made TechFlow successful. The preliminary prospectus valued the company at $847 million pre-IPO, a number that still made me pause and reread documents to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding the magnitude of what we'd built. The timing felt symbolically appropriate. 18 months ago, I'd been dismissed as someone still finding her path who needed to accept life's limitations. Now, I was preparing to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange as CEO of a company that had revolutionized predictive analytics for financial markets across 3 continents. Dad's transformation during this period had been gradual, but genuine. The man who'd once patronized me about career prospects now asked thoughtful questions about market expansion strategies and regulatory challenges. His engineering background gave him framework for understanding the technical complexity of our algorithms, and his business experience helped him appreciate the achievement of building sustainable competitive advantages in a crowded market. The breakthrough in our relationship had come during a family dinner 6 months after the retirement party, when Dad had asked a question that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. How did you solve the latency problems that plague most real-time trading algorithms? The technical conversation that followed was the first time in our relationship that he'd treated my expertise as genuinely valuable rather than impressive for someone with my supposed limitations. Mark's journey toward redemption had been more complex and painful. The golden child who'd spent decades basking in unearned praise was forced to rebuild his identity around honest self-assessment rather than family mythology. His consulting business had finally closed 3 months earlier, but instead of seeking more family financial support, he'd taken a position with the established firm where his performance would be measured against objective standards. I spent so many years believing my own marketing materials, he'd confessed during one of our first honest conversations. I convinced myself that confidence was the same as competence, that optimistic projections were the same as realistic planning. Watching you actually build something revolutionary made me realize how much I'd been fooling myself about what success actually looks like. The genuine pride Dad now took in my accomplishments felt different from the manufactured enthusiasm that had characterized his support for Mark's ventures. When business publications featured TechFlow's expansion into Asian markets, Dad shared the articles with his former colleagues, not because he felt obligated to brag about his children, but because he was genuinely excited about innovations that were changing entire industries. The IPO roadshow had taken me to investor meetings in 12 cities over 6 weeks, presenting TechFlow's growth strategy to institutional investors who managed hundreds of billions in assets. The reception had been consistently enthusiastic, with multiple fund managers describing our technology as transformational and our business model as defensible in ways that create sustainable value. The personal growth that accompanied TechFlow's business expansion was equally significant. 3 years of building something extraordinary while being systematically underestimated had taught me to trust my own judgment over others' assessments, to value authentic achievement over external validation, and to recognize the difference between people who supported my success and people who simply wanted to associate themselves with it. Family gatherings had evolved into genuinely enjoyable experiences for the first time in my adult life. Conversations focused on mutual interest and respect rather than patronizing updates about my progress or defensive explanations of Mark's latest setbacks. The extended family members who'd offered sympathetic smiles about my limitations now sought business advice with the respectful attention reserved for people whose opinions actually mattered. The measured approach I'd maintained throughout this transformation was beginning to yield dividends in ways that extended beyond family dynamics. The industry reputation I'd built through TechFlow's success had led to speaking invitations at major conferences, advisory board positions with emerging companies, and informal mentoring relationships with other entrepreneurs who were building innovative technologies. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the organic emergence of authentic family relationships based on mutual respect rather than historical hierarchy. Dad's questions about TechFlow's strategic challenges reflected genuine curiosity about problems that interested him intellectually. Mom's pride in my achievements felt earned rather than obligatory. Even Mark's attempts to understand my success seemed motivated by admiration rather than competitive anxiety. The preliminary market reception for TechFlow's IPO filing had exceeded even optimistic projections. Institutional investors were expressing interest in allocation sizes that would fully subscribe the offering within days of the roadshow's completion. The company built in coffee shops while living paycheck to paycheck was about to become a publicly traded entity valued at nearly $1 billion. Standing in my corner office overlooking downtown, reviewing final preparations for the IPO launch, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from family disappointment to public company CEO. The contrast was so dramatic it sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life, but the patents on the wall and the team meetings in the conference room reminded me that every achievement had been earned through systematic effort rather than lucky accident. The daughter whose limitations had been cataloged at a retirement party was preparing to ring the opening bell at the NYSE. The irony was too perfect to be accidental. It felt like the universe's way of ensuring that redemption came with appropriate theatrical flair. The new family photo was taken on the morning of TechFlow's IPO, in the same banquet hall where Dad's retirement party had demolished and rebuilt our understanding of family dynamics 18 months earlier. But this time, the gathering was about celebration rather than revelation, about acknowledging success rather than cataloging limitations. The contrast with family photos from previous years was startling. Instead of the artificial poses and forced smiles that had characterized earlier attempts at documenting family unity, this image captured genuine connection between people who'd finally learned to see each other clearly. Dad's arm around my shoulders felt supportive rather than patronizing. Mark's smile reflected admiration rather than competitive anxiety. Mom's pride was visible and earned rather than obligatory and strained. The journey from that devastating retirement party speech to this moment of authentic celebration had required fundamental reconstruction of relationships that had been built on false premises for decades. Each family member had been forced to abandon comfortable but inaccurate assumptions, to examine evidence rather than rely on bias, and to develop new ways of relating based on mutual respect rather than historical hierarchy. The lessons learned extended far beyond family dynamics into broader understanding of how easily intelligent people could systematically misread situations when confirmation bias aligned with cultural stereotypes. Dad's engineering precision had been completely absent from his analysis of his own children, replaced by gender-based assumptions that had led him to fund documented failure while ignoring revolutionary success. The personal empowerment that had emerged from this process was perhaps more valuable than the financial success that had triggered it. 3 years of building something extraordinary while being dismissed had taught me to trust my own judgment over others' assessments, to recognize the difference between authentic support and performative enthusiasm, and to value relationships based on genuine understanding rather than convenient mythology. The self-worth validation that came from forcing a reckoning with people who'd systematically underestimated me felt different from the satisfaction of business achievements. Professional success could be attributed to market conditions, timing, or luck, but family members' recognition that their fundamental assessment of my capabilities had been wrong represented something more personal and permanent. The forgiveness process had been gradual and conditional, built on behavioral change rather than symbolic apology. Dad's letter had been a necessary first step, but lasting reconciliation had required sustained evidence that he understood his mistakes and was committed to avoiding them in the future. The relationship we'd built over 18 months felt more authentic than anything that had existed before the retirement party revelation. Boundary setting had proven essential for maintaining psychological safety while allowing relationship rebuilding. The conditions I'd established, acknowledgement without qualification, respect for autonomy, financial independence, and authentic connection, had provided framework for interactions that felt genuinely supportive rather than subtly undermining. Mark's transformation from golden child to genuine contributor had been perhaps the most dramatic of anyone's journey. Stripped of unearned praise and forced to confront objective performance metrics, he'd discovered authentic competence in areas where his previous ventures had failed. His current success felt sustainable because it was based on honest self-assessment, rather than family mythology. The broader family system had stabilized around healthier dynamics that acknowledged reality rather than perpetuating comfortable fictions. Extended family members had learned to base their assessments on evidence rather than assumptions, to offer support that was actually helpful rather than patronizingly sympathetic, and to celebrate achievements that were genuinely worth celebrating. The reflection on personal growth revealed someone who'd emerged from systematic underestimation, stronger, more self-aware, and more capable of authentic relationships. The anger that had initially motivated TechFlow's secretive development had transformed into something more productive, a commitment to proving wrong anyone who underestimated my potential while building something genuinely valuable for the world. The thoughts on forgiveness had evolved from resistance to acceptance, but with clear understanding that reconciliation required mutual effort and sustained behavioral change. I'd learned to distinguish between people who were genuinely committed to understanding and people who simply wanted to associate themselves with success without acknowledging their previous dismissiveness. The establishment of healthy family dynamics felt like the completion of a long journey that had begun with a devastating speech about my limitations and ended with authentic recognition of my achievements. The relationships that emerged from this process were more valuable than those that had been damaged because they were based on truth rather than convenient fiction. The final thoughts on boundaries and personal growth centered on the understanding that authentic relationships required mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's well-being. The family members who'd been willing to examine their assumptions and change their behavior had earned access to rebuilt relationships. Those who'd insisted on maintaining comfortable fictions had been gently but firmly excluded from my inner circle. Standing in that banquet hall, looking at a family photo that captured genuine connection for the first time in decades, I felt the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully demanded to be seen clearly rather than through the distorting lens of others' biases. The daughter whose limitations had been catalogued with such confidence had forced a reckoning that left everyone with better understanding of reality. The story that had begun with humiliation had ended with empowerment, but more importantly, it had ended with authentic family relationships built on mutual respect rather than systematically maintained misunderstanding. The tables hadn't just been turned, they'd been rebuilt entirely, and everyone was finally sitting where they belonged.